So we will be moving on to our next presenter of the morning, and that is Abigail Randall. Her work is Opportunities for Bipartisanship, Comparing Water and Climate Policy in the Great Lakes Region. Her thesis advisor is Stacy Coyle in the program in the Environment and English, and her reader is Sarah Mills from the Ford School of Public Policy. So Abigail, I'll turn it over to you.
Hi everyone, I'm going to start sharing my presentation with you all, so hopefully you can all see that okay. Let's start that. Okay, so I'm Abigail Randall, and I will be talking to you all today about my honors thesis, which is called Opportunities for Bipartisanship, Comparing Water and Climate Policy in the Great Lakes Region. So kind of starting off, I'm going to start with a bit of an introduction, talking about the Great Lakes and about partisanship in the Great Lakes region around climate policy. So the Great Lakes, they represent 20% of the world's fresh water supply. The basin itself supports 30 million people, and it spans 8 states and 2 countries. Those states are New York, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, and Minnesota, and the 2 countries are the United States and Canada. In Michigan alone, the Great Lakes provide 823,000 jobs. Residents of the Great Lakes region, they believe that the Great Lakes significantly impact their local economy as well as their everyday lives. And so I've lived in Michigan my whole life. I've been a lifelong Michigander, and I can kind of attest to the cultural and economic significance that people in the Great Lakes region feel towards the Great Lakes. And so given this deep economic and cultural connection to the Great Lakes, that's kind of what started my thesis process in kind of exploring an option where these connections could present an opportunity for bipartisanship in environmental policy. So moving into partisanship, party affiliation is one of the strongest indicators for climate policy support or opposition, basically meaning that when people identify with a party, they will usually follow their party's cues on climate policy support or opposition. And so kind of adding on to that, most people do not think that climate change will affect them or many other people, which is almost the opposite of what's happening in the Great Lakes, where people very tangibly see the impacts of the Great Lakes on their local culture and economy. And this is understandable. You know, most of the research that I found kind of was setting that individuals, that climate change is so nebulous and it's a global phenomenon that it's hard to see the individual impacts in your own daily lives. And so by narrowing in on more locally relevant environmental policies, this may make space for more bipartisanship in climate policy. And so those locally relevant policies in this instance are going to be Great Lakes water policies. So to explore these issues, I formulated 2 research questions, which were the first one being, does party affiliation affect support for Great Lakes water policies? And the second one being, how does bipartisanship in Great Lakes water policy compare to bipartisanship in climate policies for the same region? And as I formulated these questions, I also came up with hypotheses to go along with them. So those 2 hypotheses were, party affiliation will affect support for some, but not all water policies. I came up with this hypothesis based on, as I said, people typically follow cues from their party affiliation on whether they support a policy. And so in this research, I used data from a survey, and the survey asked questions about water policy, but even more specifically dealt with issues of economic development, taxation, the role of government in water policy, which are typically areas that Democrats, Republicans, and independents would differ. And so that's how I came up with that hypothesis. The second hypothesis being that there will be more bipartisan support for water policies than climate policies. I came up with this hypothesis based on the current water policies that are governing the Great Lakes region, those being the Great Lakes Compact, the Boundary Waters Treaty, the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, and the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, which are all laws or international treaties that govern the management of Great Lakes water. And then additionally, climate policies in the region do not receive that same bipartisan support. Michiganders in particular, they do believe that climate change is occurring, and they do believe that it's caused by humans on a pretty bipartisan basis. But when it comes to how those policies should be implemented, it falls pretty much on party lines. So in order to test these hypotheses, I'm going to get into my methods and my results. My methods were that I used a survey called the Great Lakes Region Public Opinion Survey. This was a telephone survey conducted in 2014. It asked individuals from all across the Great Lakes Basin. I was able to use responses from 696 of those respondents, and they came from all 8 Great Lakes states. And so on the upper pie chart, you'll see the distribution of state of residence, and you'll see that a plurality of the respondents were from Michigan. And that's because the state of Michigan is entirely within the Great Lakes Basin, whereas states like Minnesota or Pennsylvania, only certain borderlining communities are within the Great Lakes Basin, so they represent a smaller portion of the respondents. For my control variables, I used gender, age, income, education, and length of residency. My independent variable was party affiliation. In the lower pie chart, you'll see the distribution of party affiliation, and so it was roughly evenly split between, or not evenly, split between Republicans, Independents, and Democrats, about a third each. My dependent variables were respondent reactions to 11 water policy proposals and 7 energy policy proposals. I used energy policy as a proxy for climate policy because almost any climate policy will use energy policy to kind of reach its climate policy goals. And so this is something that I found other sources doing, using energy policy as a proxy for climate. And so I decided to use that as well. And I used SPSS, which is a statistical program, to do a component analysis and run 4 separate regressions on the survey data. So getting into the component analysis placed respondent reactions into 4 separate policy areas. And so a component analysis basically will take the respondents' reactions to the policy prompts that were proposed to them, and it groups them based on similarity of response. And so those 4 policy areas were water quality, water diversions, traditional fuels, and renewables. Water quality and water diversions were used to test my water policy, or like Great Lakes policy hypotheses, and traditional fuels and renewables were the energy policy areas that were used as a proxy to measure support or opposition to climate policy. So getting into some of the results that are supported by current existing literature, that there was a bipartisan support for water policies among Democrats, Republicans, and Independents. And that was very encouraging for me to see, and that is supported by the current water policies that I had mentioned that govern the Great Lakes region, like the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative or the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, that do currently receive bipartisan support. Additionally, I found that Democrats and Independents favored renewables and Republicans favored traditional fuels. So this is also supported by existing literature, and so I was expecting to find these things. But in terms of new findings, I found that when policies incorporate protections for water, then they can receive bipartisan support. And I'll kind of get into a bit in the discussion about what this means and what those implications are. So getting into that discussion and conclusions, to revisit my hypotheses, my first hypothesis that party affiliation will affect support for some but not all water policies, this was not supported. And that was because all of the water policies received bipartisan support. So that was incredibly encouraging, especially since the water policies did ask about things like economic development or taxation or the role of government. Those all received bipartisan support, indicating that when you have a resource like the Great Lakes that have this deep cultural and economic significance, people can all come together around those policies that are good policies to govern them. My second hypothesis, that there will be more bipartisan support for water policies than climate policies, this was supported. All of the water policies received bipartisan support, whereas the climate policies fell along party lines, with Republicans being more supportive of traditional fuel sources and Democrats and Independents being more supportive of renewable fuel sources. So a lot of this has to do with how policy is framed. And so one really interesting finding that we were able to gather was from one prompt that was asked. It's this prompt here that says, phase out coal-fired power plants to reduce mercury emissions in the Great Lakes region, even if the cost of electricity increases. And so respondents were asked to rate their support or opposition to this prompt from a scale of 1 to 4. And this prompt fell into the water quality policy area, meaning that it received bipartisan support. But what we were wondering was why it was not placed into the traditional fuels policy area. This question references coal. It talks about coal-fired power plants. And there are other traditional fuel questions that did not receive bipartisan support. And that's because the other energy questions did not reference the pollutants to the Great Lakes or any impacts on the Great Lakes. So for example, one of the energy questions would have said, like, to what degree do you support or oppose offshore wind in the Great Lakes region? It wouldn't tie any sort of impact on the Great Lakes to that question. And so by framing this question in terms of pollution, we were able to kind of gather that the belief in protecting water is stronger than the belief in protecting an energy source, because people kind of got to a bipartisan consensus around this question. And current research does say that framing more substantially impacts public opinion than partisanship does. And so this provides a really interesting path forward to bipartisanship, where you can include water policy in energy policy to make people understand the implications on their culturally and economically significant natural resources. So getting into conclusions and future research, there are opportunities for bipartisanship in climate policy, which is really encouraging, and that by adding water policy to climate policy, it's possible that the cultural and economic ties to the water can also be tied to the climate. We were able to see this in that coal question, where by adding the source of its pollutants to the coal, by talking about mercury emissions in the Great Lakes, then the policy surrounding that source was able to receive a bipartisan response. So by including water policy and climate policy, there is hope that future climate policies can receive some of that bipartisan support. In terms of future research, I would like to see if this phenomenon occurs outside of the Great Lakes region. Within the United States and even around the world, there are plenty of natural resources that people have cultural and economic ties to. Kind of going along with the water theme, in the United States, there's places like San Francisco Bay, Puget Sound, Chesapeake Bay, that all kind of have that very deep cultural and economic ties to the people living in those regions. I would also like to see if there are other opportunities for bipartisanship in climate policy. I read a lot of research about partisanship in climate or environmental policy, and there's plenty of research highlighting the differences between parties in those areas, but there's very few research that highlights the commonalities between political party responses to policy. And so that would need more research to find more steps forward to bipartisanship. And that is all that I have for you guys. I want to take this time to thank my thesis co-advisors, Stacey Coyle and Sarah Mills. You guys have been incredibly supportive and helpful throughout this entire process, and I really appreciate all of your feedback and help. So thank you for that, and I'm available for questions.
Great, thank you so much, Abigail. We'll open it up for some questions.
So Abby, I'll ask a question unless Sarah wants to jump in.
I was typing, but if my connection's okay. My question was about, you've been doing some research on renewable energy in Michigan specifically, and your job coming up is going to be on solar energy nationwide. So what do you think that looks like? How do you get bipartisan support for renewables in the Great Lakes region, given what you found? How do you tie it to the Great Lakes?
You know, in terms of the research I've been doing with you, Sarah, and what I will be doing going forward, I think a lot of like reaching that bipartisan support comes from getting community support and emphasizing the benefits of renewable energy for a community, like emphasizing the tax benefits, the property value benefits, and really getting into how something like renewable energy can bring a lot of revenue into really rural communities that could use it. And so emphasizing the benefits of that, and then also emphasizing resiliency that comes along with renewable energy. You know, even now we can see oil prices are plummeting, and so something like renewable energy, where you need less people maintaining it, and it just goes, and you have energy, and it requires a lot less maintenance. Something like that is a lot more resilient. So I think we're at a really unique point in time where we can reach some more bipartisanship in renewable energy in the Great Lakes region, and even broader to emphasize resiliency, you know, domestic energy production, and kind of the benefits to individual communities.
No one else was going to jump in here. By the way, great job, Abigail, and it was a pleasure to work with you on this whole project. I think kind of what I want to point out is that what's really important about your research, and it kind of tying to what you're talking about in terms of how we frame climate policy. And typically when we deal with energy, what we try to do is emphasize the economics. You know, you're talking to a state like Wyoming about the devastation of the coal industry, and should we invest in these big wind farms and big solar panels, and the appeal is typically through economics. But that is not getting them on board with kind of climate change. And I think what's important about yours is trying to tie it to valuable natural resources. Now, not every community in every state has that close connection to a very particular natural resource like their Great Lakes. But I think it's a great contribution to what we need to do to think about more creative ways to get people to move forward with the transition to renewables beyond always kind of relying on the economics, because sometimes the economics just don't seem real to people until you get it at some scale, because people are going to get displaced from their jobs. So anyway, just that's just kind of highlighting why I think it's so important.
Thank you.
So Jason, did you still have a question, or was yours covered?
I can ask a quick question, Abby. I think what you've done is really interesting, because I feel like it speaks to this issue of not just framing, but also identities, and how we identify with either like a set of political beliefs, or we identify with maybe where we live. And I'm struck by the fact that you're kind of looking at it, how do we maybe leverage these identities in a way that gains more support? But I'm struck by it could also work the opposite way, right? Like you could imagine somebody that's against wind power, for instance, right, saying that, well, wind turbines degrade, aesthetic quality, and that can have a negative impact. And I wonder if that was something that came up in how you kind of thought about some of these issues of the kind of the push and pull, that you could use the framings to kind of exploit identities in different kinds of ways.
Right. Well, I did look at other instances of like kind of the interaction between water and energy. A good example, at least in Michigan and in the Great Lakes region, is with Line 5, which is a pipeline that runs under the Straits of Mackinac. And people were never really all that concerned with Line 5 until Line 6B, which is another pipeline that's owned by Enbridge, until that spilled into the Kalamazoo River. And so once that spilled, then people became more aware of the environmental implications, and that's when they started to oppose something like Line 5. So it's really only once people kind of see this threat to their identity, like their water resource, their cultural, something that's tied so close to their culture, that they become aware and start to either support or oppose things like energy in one way or another. So it's really only once people see that threat to their own natural resources that they respond to that. So that's kind of what I found in other portions of my research.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Abby. You did a lovely job. We virtually applaud you, but very nice job presenting your work, and very well done over the course.
Thank you. I appreciate it.